Frank Herbert wrote Dune as a warning, specifically a warning about what happens when a society becomes so desperate for a savior that it will manufacture one, and what happens to the person unlucky enough to be cast in that role. Most people who watched Dune Part 2 in theaters left the cinema having witnessed something that felt like a triumph. Paul Atreides, betrayed, exiled, hunted, rises to become the leader of an entire people and takes his revenge on those who destroyed his family. It plays like a hero's journey. It is edited like a hero's journey. Timothée Chalamet's face is lit like a hero's journey. It is not a hero's journey. Herbert himself said the story was meant as a caution against charismatic leaders, against the very human instinct to hand your judgment over to someone who tells you they were chosen. Today we're going to look at what psychology actually sees when it watches Paul Atreides become the Messiah. Because the most dangerous thing about Paul isn't a power he acquires along the way. It's a story that was told about him before he ever had the chance to become anyone at all. Before Paul ever sets foot on Arrakis, the prophecy already exists. Generations earlier, the Bene Gesserit, a secretive order that has spent centuries manipulating bloodlines and planting religious mythology across the galaxy, seeded the legend of the Lisan al-Gaib, a messiah who would arrive among the Fremen people and lead them to paradise. This is not a supernatural detail. It is one of the most psychologically precise elements in the entire story. Psychologists call this a self-fulfilling prophecy, a prediction that, once believed, actively causes the very outcome it predicts to occur. The Bene Gesserit didn't just predict a Messiah would come. They engineered the conditions under which any sufficiently capable, charismatic outsider would be received as one. When Paul arrives among the Fremen exhibiting exactly the traits the prophecy described, because he was trained from birth in Bene Gesserit disciplines specifically designed to produce those traits, the Fremen don't experience this as coincidence. They experience it as confirmation. This is the same psychological mechanism behind confirmation bias, operating at civilizational scale. Once a population is primed to look for a specific pattern, nearly any sufficiently impressive figure will appear to fulfill it. The prophecy doesn't predict Paul. The prophecy manufactures the conditions for Paul to be believed. And here is the detail that makes this genuinely unsettling rather than simply clever plotting. Paul knows this. From very early in the story, he understands exactly what mechanism is at work. He knows the prophecy is manufactured propaganda. He uses it anyway. One of the most important psychological threads running through Dune Part 2 is what happens to a person's decision-making when they come to believe their path is predetermined. Paul experiences visions throughout the film, prescient glimpses of possible futures, some of which show catastrophic holy wars fought in his name across the galaxy, the deaths of billions. Psychologists who study what's sometimes called an external locus of control identify a specific and consequential shift that occurs when people come to believe their outcomes are determined by forces outside their own choices: fate, destiny, prophecy, a higher power. When someone believes an outcome is inevitable, their sense of personal moral responsibility for that outcome measurably decreases. Not because they consciously decide to stop caring, because the psychological architecture of choice itself changes. Paul sees the holy war coming. He sees the billions of deaths his ascension will cause. And rather than this knowledge functioning as a brake, a reason to turn away from the path, it increasingly functions as a kind of permission. If it's going to happen no matter what I choose, then my choices don't really matter. If I'm going to become this figure regardless, then becoming this figure faster, more completely, more effectively, is simply pragmatic. This is one of the most dangerous psychological traps a powerful person can fall into: the conviction that an outcome is inevitable, which paradoxically makes them more willing to actively cause it. What makes this especially unsettling in Paul's case is that the prophecy isn't actually a supernatural certainty. It is a story, a manufactured one, one that Paul himself knows was manufactured. And yet the psychological effect of believing in it operates almost identically to genuine fate. The belief itself becomes the mechanism of its own fulfillment, regardless of whether the underlying prophecy is true. If Dune Part Two has a psychological conscience, it belongs to Chani. Throughout the film, as the Fremen increasingly embrace Paul as their prophesied Messiah, Chani remains one of the only people who consistently refuses the mythology. She loves Paul as a man. She resists him as a god. This distinction is psychologically crucial, and it's worth sitting with. Chani's resistance isn't cynicism, it's clarity. She has watched colonial and religious mythologies get used to control her people before. She recognizes the mechanism because she has seen its cost. And she watches with mounting horror as the man she loves increasingly chooses the mythology over the relationship. As Paul begins speaking in the prophetic register, using the language of destiny rather than the language of a person making choices, Chani experiences what psychologists studying relationships with cult leaders and charismatic figures describe as a specific and devastating loss. It isn't that Paul stops loving her. It's that the version of Paul capable of choosing her over the mythology is disappearing, replaced by a performance of destiny that Paul himself increasingly cannot distinguish from his actual self. Researchers who study identity fusion, the psychological process by which a person's personal identity becomes merged with a role, cause, or group identity, describe exactly this pattern. As identity fusion deepens, the person's ability to act from purely personal motivation erodes. Decisions that would once have been personal become decisions made in service of the role. Chani sees this happening in real time and cannot stop it. Her presence in the film functions as a kind of psychological control group, proof that another path was genuinely available. Paul could have chosen the man Chani loved over the Messiah the Fremen needed. He didn't. That choice, made freely with full knowledge of its cost, is what separates Paul from a simple victim of circumstance and makes him something closer to what Herbert always intended him to be. There's a specific psychological and narrative pattern operating underneath Dune that's worth naming directly, because Herbert built the entire story around critiquing it. Paul is modeled partly on Lawrence of Arabia, an outsider who enters an existing culture, becomes extraordinarily skilled in that culture's practices faster than the people who were born into it, and ultimately ascends to lead them. Psychologically, this narrative pattern is seductive precisely because it flatters a specific and common fantasy: the idea that true belonging is earned through exceptional individual competence rather than through the deep, unglamorous work of actual relationship and shared history. Paul spends much of the film insisting he simply wants a quiet life among the Fremen, earning his place, falling in love, belonging on his own merits. But the film is deliberately structured so that Paul's desire for ordinary belonging and his trajectory toward extraordinary power are never actually in conflict. Every skill he demonstrates, every act of belonging he earns simultaneously accelerates his rise toward messiahship. Denis Villeneuve has been explicit that this was intentional. Herbert wanted audiences to notice the discomfort of watching a supposed hero figure be exactly what his own narrative claims he is not. This is where the film asks something genuinely difficult of its audience. It uses every cinematic tool available: sweeping music, heroic lighting, a rousing final battle, to make Paul's ascension feel triumphant. And then it asks you to notice that you were cheering for exactly the thing the story is warning you about. That discomfort is not a filmmaking failure. Villeneuve built it deliberately. The gap between how the ascension feels and what it actually is. That gap is the entire psychological point. By the end of the film, Paul has fully accepted the mantle of Lisan al-Gaib. He has drunk the water of life. He has access to visions spanning countless possible futures. and in nearly all of them, he sees the same outcome: a holy war fought in his name across the entire galaxy, billions of deaths. Psychologists who study charismatic authority, drawing on foundational work by sociologist Max Weber, identify a specific and consistently observed pattern. Charismatic leaders derive their authority not from institutional position or rational legal legitimacy, but from a perceived exceptional, almost supernatural quality that followers attribute to them. This form of authority is uniquely dangerous because it is functionally unconstrained. There is no institution to check it, no process to slow it down. Only the belief of the followers and the willingness of the leader to accept what that belief authorizes them to do. Paul sees the holy war coming with total clarity. He is not deceived about the cost of what he's building, and he proceeds anyway, not because he's forced to, but because the machinery of charismatic authority he has allowed himself to become the center of has its own momentum now. Stopping would mean disappointing an entire people who have reorganized their reality around his mythology. Stopping would mean admitting the man Chani loved was right, and the Messiah was a story. This is the final and most psychologically devastating insight of Dune Part Two. Paul Atreides is not overthrown by his power. He is not corrupted in some sudden, dramatic moment. He simply discovers that once enough people believe a story about you, unwinding that story costs more than continuing it, even when continuing it costs everyone else everything. So what does the psychology of Paul Atreides actually tell us? It tells us that Frank Herbert understood something in 1965 that remains urgently relevant now, that the desire for a savior is not a flattering thing to project onto a leader. It's a warning sign about the society doing the projecting. It tells us that self-fulfilling prophecies don't require anything supernatural to function. They only require enough people to believe strongly enough, and one sufficiently capable person willing to let the belief carry them. It tells us that destiny thinking, the conviction that an outcome is inevitable, doesn't just fail to prevent catastrophic choices. It actively enables them by dissolving the sense of personal responsibility that might otherwise stop a person at the edge. And it tells us that the most dangerous leaders are rarely the ones who seize power through force. They are the ones we hand it to willingly, because we wanted desperately for someone to be exceptional enough to save us. Paul Atreides never had to take the galaxy by force. We were always going to give it to him. Next time on Real Psychology, we're trading the desert for a workshop. We're looking at Tony Stark and the psychology of genius, control, and what happens when a man builds an entire identity out of being the smartest person in every room he ever enters. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I'll see you there.